To our session with the International Trade Committee and the Secretary of State of the Department of International Trade, Dr. Liam Fox. Dr. Fox, can I ask your two comrades to introduce themselves this morning, please, just for the record?
John Alty, I'm the Director General for Trade Policy in the Department.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Catherine Vaughan, I'm the Director General Chief Operating Officer in the Department.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, this Brexit is not going brilliantly, is it? We're now dancing to the tune that's given to us by the European Commission of the 31st of October, a date that's become almost a holy day for some Brexiteers. But raining on the parade this morning is Canada. Companies are very concerned about the 31st of October with the annual reporting they do and their financial year running concurrent with the calendar year. Big companies in the global equities manufacturing sector. Where are we exactly? I mean, I think the only bit of good news I've seen coming from you is the possibility of Scottish independence coming out of this. So thank you for banging that drum. But Canada, tell us, what's happening?
Well, let me answer your whole question, or your whole 10 questions.
Thank you,
Chairman.
I will tick them off as you're answering.
Yes. In terms of Brexit in general, of course, I've voted 3 times to leave the European Union with a deal. Had Parliament done so, we would have left the European Union in March, and we'd now be discussing our future partnership with the European Union. But
as long as Conservative colleagues here,
no, but I make the point to any chairman who decide that we should not leave the European Union with the deal, and so we still will continue to seek to leave with a negotiated settlement, which gives us better predictability all round, and the government continues its policy of preparing for no deal if ultimately that's what Parliament decides that the country must do.
Why, when you told us in a letter on the 17th of June, you wrote to me saying the negotiations with Canada were at an advanced stage and we continue to make progress. What has happened to that progress that was at an advanced stage since the 17th of June?
Well, the progress was very advanced. In fact, we reckoned above 99% of agreement. The difference there was, as ever, that the signals coming from our Parliament were conflicting. Countries were negotiating with us on the basis that there would be potential of a no-deal exit. When Parliament then says Parliament will make sure that there is no possibility of a no-deal exit, those we're negotiating with get mixed signals. If Parliament continues to be inconsistent, it's very difficult for the government to maintain a consistent position in terms of negotiations. The other change, of course, was the publication of the temporary Day 1 tariffs. And we have made clear to the Canadian government that, of course, any advantage that they see getting from the Day 1 liberalisation would be a temporary arrangement and not something they could count on for a period of certainly more than a year. So to not come to an agreement for a no-deal exit would put at risk the potential Canadian exports to the United Kingdom were the UK to change those emergency Day 1 tariffs in the future, for which reason my advice is still to the Canadian government to seek to make an agreement which covers us in all circumstances.
So we've learned there from your answer that 99% deal is not quite over the line. A 99% deal can fall apart before the final 1%. And we also see that...
No, that agreement is still there. That agreement has not changed. What has changed is the perceived advantage that the Canadians think they can get from the Day 1 tariffs. Again, I make the point. Those Day 1 tariffs are not permanent tariffs. They're a temporary arrangement entered into to prevent an price input shock to the UK economy. They do not guarantee access on that basis to the UK economy.
So we have ourselves in a situation where a 99% agreed deal is not a 100% deal, and it's not going to happen. There's major alarm, as we can see this morning, of a no deal with Canada. Given that some of the prime ministerial candidates are talking about the chance of the UK leaving and having a no deal with the entire European Union on the 31st of October, the date given to us, I think, by Donald Tusk and his friends, how much more prepared are you now for a no deal than you were in March 2019?
When I last, in terms of trade access, when I was last in front of the committee, we had 100% agreed for what would have been 28% of the 10.7% of UK trade that's currently carried out under EU trade agreements. That today
sits about 2.5%.
That today sits at 63% of that 10.7%, and following some very constructive discussions I had yesterday with South Africa and recently with countries such as Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, those numbers potentially would go up. But I reiterate the point that when these countries hear mixed messages coming from the UK that we are preparing to leave without a deal, and then we hear people saying that Parliament would frustrate that and not allow no deal to happen. And then we hear the EU saying, well, the UK may not have control over this. It sends very conflicting signals to those that we are engaged with in terms of continuity agreements.
Would you be voting for any Conservative Party leader that was elected and promising no deal? Would you vote and back them to become Prime Minister? If they're promising no deal.
I'm answerable for the government policy in terms of trade, Chairman. I'm not getting into a media circus on Tory party leadership.
I mean, if you're saying that across the world people are paying attention to what's happening, and you're there as the Secretary of State for International Trade, and you're in a position with a vote to decide should somebody become Prime Minister and they're promising no deal, what signal do you want to send out across the world on trade on that? Well,
both candidates, as far as I'm aware, have said that they want to leave the European Union with a deal. They want to leave with the right deal. And I should think that's what the whole of Parliament would want to do, if, of course, they were Democrats.
They're both prepared to leave without a deal, and Mr Hunt was actually talking about leaving the end of September without a deal. He was getting harder, he was getting tougher. The macho talk was getting better.
The government's policy has been to prepare for no deal because the UK cannot guarantee no deal on its own. The European Union could reach a position where it did not want, for example, to extend beyond the 31st of October and there would be no deal. No deal is the default position in British legislation. That is what happens if we can't reach a deal.
The UK, and just a final point from me at the moment, the UK has one sovereign power here where it doesn't rely on anybody else, and that is the revocation of Article 50, which could save the UK from the calamity. Would you rule out the revocation of Article 50? What signal do you want to send across the world on that? The sensible thing to do in the facing down the battle of disaster would be to revoke Article 50, but I've got a feeling you wouldn't be for that at all. You'd rather flirt with disaster than do that. Is that correct?
Well, your Chairman, you say the sensible thing to do. I would say the fundamentally undemocratic thing to do would be to revoke Article 50, because in this country, Parliament, including everyone sitting round this committee, said to the people of this country, we will offer you the choice of our future relationship with Europe, and a leaflet went to every house saying, we will honour that decision. The people took their decision. It is the duty of all parliamentarians who are genuine Democrats to honour that.
You might want to be better briefed of where the Scottish National Party were at that point. But anyway, Nigel Evans.
Well, Chairman, there was also a referendum in Scotland. I would expect the Scottish Government to be democratic in that also to honour the result of the referendum.
Thank you for opening that up, Secretary of State. That was the referendum where we were told Scotland stay in the United Kingdom to guarantee your place in the European Union in a family of nations. We see what a family of nations means with the respect Ireland has shown in the European Union.
The SNP's internal pain is not really for
it's certainly not our internal pain. Our internal pain is in the United Kingdom.
It's nice to be on this committee when some members clearly haven't quite made it, and we've got a majority of Brexiteers at this moment in time.
I'm sure Labour
hopefully we can make some positive progress on this. I'm clearly following the leadership campaigns of both candidates. Well, both want to leave with a deal, quite as you've just stated, Secretary of State, but also both have said that if needs be, they will leave without a deal. Is one of the options for that leaving with Article 24 of GATT, so that we can continue with the tariff-free trade with the European Union for a period?
Well, the whole of our exit and what relationships we're going to have are dependent on the fact that two parties would come to an agreement.
Yeah.
The idea that you could invoke Article 24 unilaterally and that Britain could continue its current trade is, of course, unrealistic. Were we, for example, to get to the end of an implementation period and both parties agreed to continue to trade on the same basis, then you could make the legal case that Article 24 could be invoked. My point is not a legal one, it's a political one. The reason, if I may, Chairman, that one of the reasons that I voted to leave the European Union is that I believe it's a political project more than an economic one. Yeah. I think the example of the euro made it very clear that in order to progress to the end point of ever closer union, the European Union would be willing to tolerate economic pain. across the Union, and we've seen that manifested in high levels of youth unemployment.
Yeah.
The idea that such an organisation would say to the United Kingdom, which we know it resents being disruptive in leaving the European Union, that we could continue on exactly the same trading terms as today, I would think is unlikely.
Is there interest in them for doing that for a period at least? I mean, remember the Maltese Compromise saying that we leave the European Union now on October the 31st, then we go into the negotiations about the FTA, which is fairly well being within the European Union for that period, however long the implementation period lasts. I mean, it's very similar, I assume, to going out on Article 24, which would be in both countries' interest, wouldn't it?
Well, it's entirely possible to do a lot of things if both sides want it. The reason that I remain doubtful is that I believe that the European Union is a political project long before it's an economic project now. And I believe that there is still a strong desire to ensure that other countries don't follow the UK's example.
Yeah.
And therefore, to give the UK the same access as it has today would be seen to be rather running against that policy aim of the European Union itself. It may well be that, there's a grand enlightenment falls across the Commission, and they are happy to see the UK gain the same access to the single market as it has today, same access to the customs union it has today, without actually being part of the European Union. I have grave doubts about whether that would happen, which, again, as I say, is one of the reasons why I wanted to leave the European Union itself.
I know we had some of the announcements yesterday about some of these people who were taking over from some of the other anonymous figures like Tusk and Juncker. But nonetheless, do you think that they would be prepared to sacrifice maybe millions of jobs throughout the EU 27 just in order to spite the UK and to threaten any of the other EU 27 thinking of leaving?
I think it's about the priority that's given to the concept of ever closer union. I've always thought that. I always thought that the Euro project was a drive towards a nation state with a state currency, and that the economic consequences of that would be tolerated, and that in fact is what's happened. How the many young unemployed across Europe, particularly southern and eastern Europe, view yesterday's horse trading for high-paid bureaucratic jobs is not really for me to comment upon.
It sounds like the BBC. Julia Lopez.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody suggesting that Article 24 can be invoked unilaterally. It's whether the EU would consider, in the event of no deal, coming to a temporary agreement with the UK. Now, we've looked at the potential of going to no deal on the 29th of March and then subsequently on the 12th of April. So what discussions have you had within your department before those deadlines to think about what kind of mitigations could be discussed and offered to the EU at the point of no deal? For instance, have you drafted a draft FTA that could be put in an Article 24 situation to the EU when you considered 29th of March and the 12th of April deadlines?
Well, of course, the EU have always said they would never negotiate a future trading relationship until we had left the European Union. And they have been absolutely hardline on that issue. They've also said there can be no implementation period without a withdrawal agreement and so on. I think that part of the problem here lies in the sequential nature of those discussions rather than the concept that was, I think, the British position at the outset, which was that the withdrawal agreement and the future economic partnership were done in parallel. The sequential nature of it itself has meant that we get to this point without any discussion with the European Union because they refuse to do so on any future potential outcome. Of course, there are a number of potential trade agreements out there, the most recent being the Canadian one, which sets a potential model.
My specific question was, before the 29th of March and before the 12th of April deadline and now before the 31st of October deadline, what discussions have you had in your department as Trade Secretary as to what kind of mitigations you could consider putting towards the EU in the event that we did end up having a no deal? You must have had discussions, or have you not had discussions with your officials as to what mitigations or what offer you could put to the EU to get us through the next period?
So we have, that of course is not done by my department. That's done by DEXU. at the moment.
So you would have had no discussions about what
we have
could
no
do from a
direct
trade perspective to mitigate the impact of tariffs in the event of a no-deal situation, and what discussions you would recommend that we had with the EU in that eventuality?
We have discussions inside government, but any discussions with the European Union are done by DEXU. We have no direct contact.
What discussions have you had with government, with DEXU, to have those? So to offer them to have those discussions with the EU then?
Well, we've set out that there are a number of potential future shapes of arrangement with the EU, as the House of Commons has debated itself on a number of occasions, whether we'd want to maintain the single market with the EU, whether we would want
specifically, before those deadlines, we could have gone to a no deal after those points. Did you have any discussions within government, particularly with DEXU, about what kind of package we could put to the EU? And if so, was Article 24 one of those discussions that you had?
Yeah. John, you were involved in those?
So I think, as people have seen at the time of the 29th of March or the middle of April, the focus from the EU side was on unilateral mitigations that they were prepared to put in place. I'm not aware of discussions that may have happened with the EU. As the Secretary of State has said, it's not our department. We were focused on delivering
Sorry, specifically, I'm not asking what discussions you had with the EU. I'm asking what internal discussions the government had as potential preparations should we have left on the 29th of March or the 12th of April, which were distinct possibilities.
So specifically on trade, the primary element of that would have been on day one tariffs. And what we actually did in terms of mitigation. The primary objective of the government at that point was recognising the EU has now twice told us that they would apply full MFN tariffs to the United Kingdom if we left without a deal. That was the position that they took. And that would potentially lead to a price shock to the UK economy.
I know you're going to suggest that we've come up with our own tariffs and our own tariff schedules for no deal, and that's fine. But specifically, have you discussed what kind of offer you could put to the EU? What discussions have you had within government about the offer you could put to the EU in the event that we'd gone to no deal?
Well,
and have you had any discussions about the Article 24 mechanism in particular?
We didn't discuss that in particular because if we left with no deal, it would imply that there was no agreement on that future relationship. And of course, as I said, to apply Article 24 about a future relationship would require both sides to be in agreement.
Nobody was suggesting it can be done unilaterally, but have you thought about putting the offer?
No, I understand that, but the EU have made it very clear that in the event of no deal, that they would not seek an agreement with the United Kingdom, but they would apply full MFN tariffs with the UK as an outside country. They made that very clear to the UK, that if we left without a deal, then an agreement on a future partnership was not on the table.
Thank you. Such is the enthusiasm at the moment. I think Gareth got my first, then Marcus, then Ronald, and I will do it on that basis. Gareth, do you still want to come in? Gareth Jones.
Just wanted to be clear, from what you're saying in answer to Julia, you have had no discussions with DEXU. You have had no discussions with the Brexit Secretary, and your officials, Mr. Alty and Ms. Vaughan, have not been party to any similar conversations either.
Of course not.
Clear.
Of course not, but what was very clear to us was that in the event of a no deal, the EU were not going to enter into a new trade agreement with the United Kingdom at that point. And we have considered all the potential future options with the EU, but the EU made it very clear that unless there was a withdrawal agreement, they would not enter into negotiations with the UK about that future relationship.
Thank you. Marcus Fisher.
So is this an example, Secretary of State, of the government just taking what the EU says on face value and doing no further work?
No, but we can't have a trade agreement with ourselves.
Exactly. So you have to propose one to the EU, but you've not done any work on what you might propose.
Well, there's a huge amount of work. There are all sorts of models out there which we could use if we wanted. The problem is that the EU have made it very clear that in a no deal, they will not enter into a trade agreement with the UK at that point.
And so you've just accepted that, and you won't try
on
behalf of the British people any further?
We have a whole range of models. We could go to a CETA model, we could go to a CETA Plus model. All sorts of models are there. And, of course, the EU know what all those arrangements are because they've already entered into them with other countries. But the EU made very clear that they would not enter into negotiations with the UK until there was a withdrawal agreement. I think, if you're asking me, I think that's irrational. I think that the sensible thing to do would be to recognise that no deal could happen, and to work out what might be in the best interests of both the UK and the European economy, and to have measures in place just in case that were to happen. But that has not happened. What the EU has said is, in the event of no deal, they will immediately treat the United Kingdom as a third country. They will apply the trading rules to the UK that they would apply to any other third country, and then at some future point they would seek a negotiation. But there has been absolutely no, I'll make it very clear, there's been absolutely no willingness in any way, shape or form for the EU to consider what the fallback position would be in terms of no deal in relation to an immediate new trading relationship with the UK.
So are you looking forward to a situation where we might have a government who might do the work on what a proposal to the EU might look like to in fact put our interests on the table?
It doesn't matter how many proposals we have if the European Union say they will not enter into an agreement. However much we want there to be an agreement, we have to have the European Union's agreement to it. That's the whole point. I would very much have preferred from the outset that, because there was always a possibility of no deal, that the European Union was willing to say, in the event of no deal, which is a democratic potential outcome in the UK, what would the fallback position be? The fallback position has been, if there is no deal, Britain will be treated as a third country outside the EU, and at some point in the future there will be a negotiated settlement.
So is it fair to say that if you're involved in a future government, perhaps led by Mr Hunt, that you won't try to put an agreement on the table in the same way as has not happened under the previous one?
There are all sorts of potential agreements there, but it takes two sides to have an agreement. This idea that we can unilaterally want an agreement and the EU will agree to it, I think is fanciful. It's the whole reason. It's the whole. If I may finish, it's the whole reason. It's the whole.
With respect, let Secretary of State finish.
The whole reason.
Excuse me.
Hold on.
The whole reason why I voted, or one of the many reasons why I voted to leave the European Union, is that I've always believed they would put the political imperative of ever closer union and holding the project together ahead of the economic interests. And if that required them to have no agreement with the UK, that's what they would do.
So am I to understand that you're not willing to conceive of any other offer from the UK government to the EU than a withdrawal agreement?
No, we can, and there are all sorts of things that we can offer the European Union. But the European Union has been very clear in its position from the very beginning and we can offer them a customs union. We could offer them a single market, which I think both of us would not want to see. We could offer them a CETA Plus agreement. We could offer them all sorts of ranges of things. But the European Union have said that they are not willing to enter into a discussion with us about any future trade relationship until we
Your colleagues are desperate to come in, Mr. Fish.
I think the country watching will be able to see from that what the position is. But it is true, is it not, to say that an FTA is not the same terms of market access as we have with the EU at the moment. So we are not talking about a standstill and a continuity agreement within such an FTA that reflects the exact same terms, which is what you were saying was the essential reason why the EU wouldn't want to accept such an offer. So given that that is the case, why wouldn't we have done any work on this?
And can I tag into that? On the 29th of March, the UK blinked. In April, the UK blinked. There will be no European Commission in place to negotiate with up until the 1st of November, which is the day after the famous 31st of October. Should the UK blink again, or should it go for no deal?
I think if it's clear that the European Union leaders want a deal that Britain is happy with, then we should pursue it. My view is that if it's very clear that the European Union will not accept a deal that we find acceptable, that we do what our law says, which is to leave without a deal on the 31st of October. I've never changed my view on this. And my view has always been, as Mr. Fish says, that it's been very clear. You cannot have under any FTA the same level of access as you have as a member of the customs union and the single market. And the question is what the EU subsequent to that would accept. Now, I would hope that if Britain left without a deal, that the European Union would understand that there was an economic imperative to have a trade agreement with the United Kingdom. That would be in the interests of all our citizens. My worry is that, as I've said, in the European Union, it's not the economic imperative that's put at the top of the list, it's the political one.
Thank you. Ronald J. Warden and then Matt Western. Ronald.
So in respect of the United Kingdom blinking, if we stare the EU out, and if we end up, because it is not possible to amend the withdrawal agreement, which is what they say, I don't believe that to be the case, but if they mean what they say, and we choose not to blink this time, are you really saying that at some future point is in the distant future, or that actually, for the reasons you've just outlined, that the economic imperative is there, that future point comes much sooner, and Article 24 could be used, as WTO has told this committee when we have visited WTO, as an interim step, because taking in good faith what the EU has said, that they do want to have a trade agreement of some form with us, whether that is as currently put forward or in an alternative form, taking that in good faith, Article 24 could be used.
That is a difficult question to answer because it depends on the political willingness, not the economic and not the legal basis, but the political willingness of the EU to enter into such an agreement. But
don't politicians care about the jobs their people have?
Well, my entire reservation, as I've already said, for example, about the introduction of the euro, it was for a political reason irrespective of the economic cost. I would take that experience strongly into account when I was trying to make a decision about how the European Union might react. And the question would be, given that we've seen that track record, would the European Union be willing to allow the UK what would be perceived by the hardline integrationists in Europe as very much preferential trading, having had the disruption of leaving the European Union? Now, it is entirely right, we might both 100% agree that the rational economic thing to do would be to seek as much continuity as possible. The question is, would that be the calculation, or would the political imperatives take precedence over that? My worry would be the latter. I'm afraid. I would love to say that sensible calculations about the prosperity of our citizens would be at the top of the list. I'm afraid that my belief is that in the European Union, the political end point of ever closer union is the driving force behind their decision making, not necessarily the economic well-being.
But surely Her Majesty's government's policy is not that because of flawed decision making in the European Union we should just agree to whatever they propose. And surely this government has identified ways forward, as Mrs. Lopez indicated or questioned, and I'm not sure we got the clarity that this committee would like. Surely the government has prepared plans to bring forward an Article 24 letter. Surely the government has identified the British preferred route in the event of a no deal. Because it'd be absurd to have not done that preparation, much like, dare I say, a former Prime Minister did not do in respect of a referendum, simply because the government thought that an agreement might go through.
Well, the government looks at all the options, but the government looks at all the options in relation to what the other side of the negotiation has said that they're willing to tolerate. If the European Union were to say, in the event of no deal, we are open to all offers about trade continuity, of course, that would be one thing. But the European Union have not said that. And they've not said it for the very reasons...
You said at some future point they would countenance an agreement. So, therefore, surely this government has done some preparation for that future point. Whenever that future point might come, this government wouldn't go through this process, surely, without...
But we've set out already in public what we want the future trading relationship to look like, that we want to have as frictionless trade as possible outside the single market and the customs union.
In the event of a no deal?
in all events, that's what we want to see. That is our position, that we want as frictionless trade as possible. The point here is that, and this is where I have a little bit of difficulty. So I think that the European imperative is political. I think it's the drive towards a closer union. I think experience has told me that they will choose that over potential economic disruption. I therefore find it on slightly the naive side, if I may say, that they would suddenly change that tack.
But is it not our responsibility
with Britain having voted to leave the European Union, with the disruption that they perceive politically that has caused, that they would say, never mind, you can get the best possible trading relationship on day one?
Well, I might then counter that by saying, is it not irresponsible for Her Majesty's government not to prepare for a so-called no deal? Is it not irresponsible for Her Majesty's government not to have prepared an Article 24 process internally? Is it not irresponsible for Her Majesty's government not to have identified alternative trade agreements that it might want to take forward? Because a negotiation requires both sides to have a perspective. And so why are we not doing that?
And we've looked at Article 24 some time ago, and of course all these options are on the table. But all these options are not on the table if the EU doesn't want to take them.
My question?
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, always good to see you. And sorry I was a little bit late, but just going back to when I think one of the times, last time we met, and in this forum, and we were talking about no deal, and I think you said that a no deal would be hugely suboptimal. Last week we had the reception with the SMMT, and I'm sure you talked to a lot of the manufacturing suppliers and so on at that event. Do you still hold that view, that it's hugely suboptimal, a no deal?
Yes, I'd much rather leave with an agreement. I think it's beneficial. But I think that we're weighing up, again, a number of different things here, perhaps in the opposite from we've just been discussing them there. Yeah. We also have to take different things into account in this country. So I would say economically it's suboptimal. I would say democratically, not leaving is the most suboptimal outcome. And I've always said there are three potential outcomes to this process. We leave the EU with a deal, we leave the EU without a deal, or we don't leave the EU. The Chairman mentioned revocation right at the beginning. I would regard revocation as the worst possible outcome because of the damage it would inflict on the credibility of our political system. I think, therefore, not leaving, for me, would be entirely democratically unacceptable because I believe it's a betrayal of Parliament's relationship with the electorate. So if we can just park that for a moment. And then we've got the choice then of leaving without a deal or leaving with a deal, and I think leaving with a deal is preferable. If we have to leave without a deal, there are mitigations we can put in place. My department's responsible for a number of those things, of trade continuity agreements, of the Trade Remedies Authority, of the government procurement agreement, and involved in the process of setting of day one tariffs, all of which provide mitigations. But they're, in my view, less optimal than maintaining a period of stability during which time we do properly enter into that new trading relationship for the future.
On the radio this morning, Radio 4, there was one of the junior ministers talking about just how unprepared small businesses are, and in the next couple of months a lot of work will be done to prepare them. There's not much time left, though, is there?
It's an interesting question as to how prepared small businesses really are. The government has had for months now advice lines open. Our department, I think, is able to cope with 1,100 a day. We've been getting something like 20 at peak times in terms of the number of inquiries coming from small business. A lot of those small businesses won't trade exclusively with the European Union. A lot of them will do so through agents who will already have been doing that work for them. Some of them may be prepared. It's an absolute unknown. How many won't be ready? But there are some things that we can say in some sectors. Automotive, we can have mitigations in terms of our day one tariffs. We can help in terms of supply chains, for example. In that, there are other areas where we have less ability to have those mitigations. I think of farming as one. In terms of tariffs, there's so much we can do, but we sell about 100 100,000 tonnes of beef and veal to the EU a year, about 15 to 17% of our production. It's worth about £342 or so million, or was at the latest prices that we looked at. Facing a huge tariff into the European Union and suddenly finding a big price increase in UK goods being sold into that market would undoubtedly have a market shock to the UK, even if we had protective tariffs to prevent flows in the other direction. So that it's unavoidable that it would be suboptimal economically.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rashid, you want to come in before we...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Secretary of State, you mentioned all the time, in all inquiry, that you rather leave with the deal. And could you just explain why no-deal Brexit is bad?
I think I've just done so. I think I've given the answer and an example of why it would be economically suboptimal for us.
How suboptimal?
Well, I've just mentioned in terms of giving that one sector where you can quantify it.
Can you give a percentage of GDP?
Of beef and veal. I think that's impossible to quantify, but you can look at specific sectors and where they would be affected, and you can make an assessment of what that impact would be. As I say, it's clear. I was looking for an example before I came here, Chairman, of a sector where we could quantify what the actual export is, what the share of the UK market of production it is, and what we could expect the level of tariff applied to us. And even if we were applying protective tariffs ourselves, it still leaves a lot of uncertainty in the market. So far better to have a period of transition to be able to do that.
So we agree, so no-deal Brexit could be obviously catastrophic, but
no, we didn't agree that at all. I said it was economically suboptimal and we would look for mitigations.
So, let's leave it to that. So then it's 2 years and 2.5 years Prime Ministers keep saying no deal is better than a bad deal. So, of course, you said the deal was good, we should vote it for that. But is the government prepared for no-deal Brexit? Yes and no?
Yes, the government is prepared in as much as we can be for the predictable elements of a no-deal. But there are some things that sit beyond our control. In the event of a no-deal, the EU will apply MFN tariffs to the UK. That will have an impact on a number of sectors of our economy. We can mitigate that. In farming, for example, we can utilise WTO or freedom within WTO rules to provide mitigation for that. You could provide support for that. It is allowed under WTO rules, as long as we're not infringing the WTO, for example, by stimulating production, which would be against the rules itself. Yeah. So we have a number of areas where we can do and have looked at and have made preparations for that, but it's still our view that leaving with a deal is preferable. And I don't really hear anyone in the House of Commons saying that leaving with a deal is not the best outcome, other than those who don't want to leave the European Union at all and who would, in my view, be committing a grave democratic offence to the people of this country.
Yeah, thank you. Just before I move to Gareth Thomas, large multinational companies are very worried about Brexit that is going to be at the end of the year rather than the beginning of the year. They're worried about the number of unknown unknowns. And you've said that you prefer a no deal to remaining. Do you think there's a difference between the no deal at the end of the year? Is it better or worse than the no deal would have been in March? Because certainly big companies are coming to me as committee chair. Big companies are coming to me as committee chair and saying that a no deal now is even worse than a no deal would be in March.
Well, the government is better prepared. The government has set out what it needs to do. Again, that's the DEX. You take responsibility for the integration of those and the cross-governmental elements of those. In terms of this department, we are better prepared now than we would have been in March. But I don't see that unless we are able to get a change in the narrative which convinces our trading partners that we're going to leave with no deal, that much changes until the last minute.
The Institute for Government has argued that the civil service and businesses are likely to be less prepared for a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October than they were on the 29th of March. One, they said the higher rate of change of officials, operational centres for no deal being stood down, lack of available warehousing, previous spending on no deal prep which can't be replicated, and uncertainty about the true Brexit date, because there is no European Commission till the 1st of November, so nothing can really change between the withdrawal agreement no deal what we had in March. You don't think the
this
government have a better overview than your own view of just simply your own department?
Well, I'm answerable for my department, Chairman, and I'm not answerable for what others may say about other parts. All I can say in terms of my civil service, in terms of my department, is that we are better prepared than we would have been. We have on the trade continuity agreements, we are very close to finishing. A number of countries leave a single item on the table, knowing they could remove it very quickly if a no deal did come around, but are quite understandably hedging their bets, given that they're getting mixed signals from the UK about whether Parliament would block any no deal, which I, of course, think would be democratically quite wrong. But as long as we give mixed signals, there will be an understandable temptation on their side to hold back to see how much they can get in any agreement. Then in terms of the other elements that we're responsible for protecting British business against any potential dumping and subsidy, we are ready with the trade remedies mechanisms that we would need to have. And of course we have just achieved the necessary UK accession to the government procurement agreement. So unless this department is hugely exceptional, which I sometimes like to think, but I doubt in reality if it is, then I imagine that across government all other departments are better prepared than they would have been before. But at some point, and I think this is the bottom line, we have to accept that leaving without a deal would be suboptimal, but if that's what we have to do to fulfil our democratic mandate, then that's what we have to do.
I'm glad you've communicated your view there. Clearly in March the feeling was not that. The feeling was a continuation, a mini revocation, if you like, for at least another little while. And to be clear, and you've talked about sort of mixed signals, but let's have some clear signals. Many will be watching this in business and they'll want to know your thinking and your evaluation. And I want an economic evaluation of this between the three scenarios we've talked about. We know your preference politically is deal, no deal, revocation. But which one is worse economically? Which one is suboptimal, second suboptimal? Which one is best of those three for the economy? Between deal, no deal and revocation of Article 50. Now, I'm looking for economic answers here. I'm not looking for political answers.
But I don't think you can disaggregate the political from the economic
in
that circumstance. I think that the political shock to this country and the instability, something that the Chancellor talked about
in
the speech
in March.
that he talked about back in the beginning of the year, was that if you get the sort of political turbulence that you would get in the event of revocation, that does not have calculable consequences for our economy in terms of stability and investment confidence. And that's a key element. Therefore, I think that, you asked me, I think the best outcome is to have a deal.
Economic answer. And you take in the factors you want to put in there, but people will be looking at this, boardrooms across the world, in fact, will be looking at this at your credibility, your government's credibility. Economically, of those three, no deal, deal and revocation, which is best for the economy?
To have a deal.
To have a deal. Which is best between no deal and revocation?
I've made so clear on so many occasions. First of all, you cannot disaggregate the political consequences of revocation. I think to tell the 17.4 million people who voted for something...
I'm looking for economic, I'm not looking for political.
I think
because the people of Scotland voted
because
differently,
a lot of those are businesses, a lot of those are investors, a lot of those are small businesses. And I think that if you look at the political fragmentation in other places where the democratic will of the people has been denied, it's not a route I want for the United Kingdom, because it brings with it its own economic disruption. You cannot say we'll have political disruption but it won't have any effect on the economic circumstances. I believe that revocation, betraying the British people over Brexit, will actually produce greater economic turbulence than a managed no deal.
What do you think the Scottish people and the Northern Irish people will feel when they voted quite differently? I've been taken by a very close economic, political union, the United Kingdom Union, doing things that's damaging their economy and against their will. I'm sure
there are always those who don't want a United Kingdom to exist, who will try to take advantage of any potential fear of instability to break up the union. I would not be one of them.
So what headlines do we have here? Fox warns of threat to union from no-deal Brexit. What do you mean by that?
I mean exactly what I said. There are those...
But you're countenance a no-deal Brexit.
There are those would I countenance a no-deal Brexit?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe that if the alternative is not to leave the European Union, yes, I would. I've always been very clear. I believe that that's a democratic imperative that we leave the European Union.
So you want to threaten the Union?
What did I mean by that? That headline, of course, Chairman, I think as politicians we all understand that headlines may not always reflect the text. What I meant by that was, exactly as I've said, there are those who don't want the United Kingdom to exist and who want to see it fragmented, who would use any opportunity and any fear of instability to try to break that union apart. I think that is hugely to be regretted, because I think the United Kingdom is much stronger as an integral unit, because we're not a political project in the UK, unlike the EU. We are a nation of families that has married and worked and moved now for several centuries together, unlike a 40-year political project like the European Union.
We're a union of nations, Secretary of State, is the reality. Gareth Thomas.
Dr. Fox, this could well turn out to be your last appearance before the Select Committee.
Or indeed anyone on the committee's last performance.
Given the potential...
Tomorrow is not promised.
Given the potential change in the leader of your party. It's almost 20 months since the trade bill was introduced. If this is indeed your last appearance before the committee, do you have any sense that the trade bill will have finished its journey through the House of Commons, or will its failure to have been passed be part of the legacy that you leave?
Well, in terms of leaving without a deal, of course, we want the trade bill passed, and that's a matter for the business managers and the usual channels. As a former whip, and I don't wish to intrude in any of that territory. In terms of what we need from the trade bill...
With respect, that is ducking it completely. I mean, I was a minister too, and as a minister you have considerable influence in when a bill is brought back to the House of Commons. If you wanted that bill in before the 24th of July, I have no doubt you could push for it. But isn't the truth that you have not got agreement to some of the central issues related to the trade bill, and that's why you're ducking?
No, the central relations of the trade bill had three functions. To maintain our ability to have trade with those countries who had agreements with the European Union. We have the legal powers to do that, whether we have the trade bill or not. We had the second aim was to get trade remedies in place so that British businesses would not be disadvantaged in the event of a no deal. We have those in place. In fact, it's up and running. And thirdly, to achieve membership of the government procurement agreement, which also we have. It would be much better to put on a long-term statutory basis to have the trade bill through. But I'm afraid that you're quite wrong. We are able to carry out the three main functions of the trade bill by other means without that legislation passing. Would I like to see it on the statute book and those three sections on the statute book to provide us long-term continuity? Yes, I would. Is it absolutely necessary? No, it's not.
Will it be passed by the 31st of October?
That I don't know how long this Parliament will last. I don't know whether we'll be in the same parliamentary programme. And with all due respect, neither does anyone else in this committee.
So what conversations have you had with the business managers about bringing it back before the summer, or particularly before the 31st of October?
I have a perpetual conversation on wanting to see the trade bill back. Sadly, that decision on the government parliamentary timetable is not mine.
A note of exasperation there, I detect, Secretary of State. Okay, just a note of exasperation.
Those of us, Chairman, who've actually had to have these discussions are well aware of how much individual departments have on the shape of the government's programme and the timetable for any particular week. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'm feeling this might be becoming a therapy session.
Much cheaper than group therapy, I have to say, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, this committee raised concerns about the preparedness of the new Trade Remedies Authority prior to 29th of March. How much better prepared are you in terms of trade defence now? Of course, you had more time now, and then by 31st of October you will have around 7 months more. So how well prepared now?
So we are even better prepared. So new authority is almost fully staffed now. 94%, I think, is the current level we have of the vacancies that we set out. We've been able to carry out better staff training. We've been able to introduce better working on sector-specific understanding for that, and we will carry out transition reviews once we pass the statutory instrument through Parliament, which I think is in Parliament today.
And you fully staffed now? So you know,
as I said, about 94%. So I visited, I went down to visit Reading myself to talk to our staff. I have to say, first of all, I was very impressed by how enthusiastic they were. I was impressed by the range of backgrounds that they came from. And I was very impressed by their enthusiasm to get working. Of course, while we were in the European Union, there's a nuance here. We want to have transition reviews. Transition reviews are designed to ensure that any measures that we have when we leave the European Union are done purely on UK data and not aggregated EU data. They'll take between 12 and 18 months, the transition reviews, to take place, but it is a continually improving position.
You also said you will carry forward a significant number of EU's trade remedy measures in the past. It has been argued that you must carry out investigations as to whether the UK should continue to apply these measures, otherwise you risk being challenged at the WTO. So are you carrying out those investigations?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm saying. We have to put down a statutory instrument to enable us to carry out those transition reviews, which is what is happening at the present time.
And will they be ready by 31st of October? Will they be ready by 31st of October?
Well, at the point of where we leave the European Union without a deal, we would simply take over the investigations. These are slightly transition reviews are to ensure that in future they are based on purely UK data. We wouldn't have purely UK data at the point we left the EU. If we left on the 31st of October, we would simply take over those agreements that the EU has.
Would that be legal then? It seems to be a circular argument.
Yes, it would be legal. John?
Yeah, so as the Secretary of State said, we will start the reviews shortly, and we've made very clear to other countries, WTO members, that we will be carrying out those reviews. They won't, as the Secretary of State said, all be completed by the time we leave, but we have made clear to countries that we've got an active programme there. It will obviously be for them to sort of reflect on that, but that's our intention.
But clearly, I mean, are you confident that it will be done by 31st?
We're confident that we will give continued protection to all vulnerable UK sectors. Yes, we are.
But if you haven't done the reviews by the 31st of October, and we know you can't then use somebody else's review, the European Union's reviews, you'll have to use your own reviews. This is going to be challenged at WTO.
No, we ran a call for evidence to determine which of the existing EU trade remedies measures should be transitioned at the point of exit.
And the WTO
and that has already. Yes, these are of course they are the same trade remedies that the EU is carrying at the moment. So they are of course WTO compatible.
No, have they agreed them for the UK? No, have they agreed them for the European Union? Have the WTO agreed these?
They are
for the
WTO
UK?
compatible.
Yes, for the European Union. The question is, have the WTO agreed the EU trade remedies as they are for the United Kingdom?
That isn't how the system works. John, do you want to explain?
Well, that's what I want to know.
Yes, so we're carrying forward those measures where UK industry has got an interest. We'll carry out the reviews. We've explained to the WTO members what we're doing. Obviously, it will be for them to decide how to respond to that, but we've made it very clear, and I think they understand that we're not simply rolling these measures forward without looking at them ourselves.
So they've not obviously agreed to anything. So you're talking to WTO, right? And so they are aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
But there is no guarantee that they will agree on that.
Well, they are already WTO compatible.
Yeah, but the measures will be in place.
But for the European, not for the UK.
The measures are in place. We had a call for evidence to see which of the European Union ones applied to the UK, because some clearly would apply to EU elements where there wasn't a UK interest. That was what the call for evidence was for, and we decided that we would roll over, transitioning 42 out of 104 measures which applied to the UK. And that's what we'll do. To further the evidence base, we'll carry out the transition reviews to make sure that we have UK-based evidence and we're not looking for aggregated EU evidence. The question I think you're asking me is, can I guarantee that all the protections that are currently in place for British business from dumping and subsidy will be in place at the point we leave the European Union? Yes.
And the WTO have agreed to how many of these? For the UK,
they are already in place.
Yeah, for the EU,
but they are part of international rules against dumping and subsidy.
So what you're telling us is that there will be no trouble or no aggravation at all from the WTO when the UK adopts another economic bloc's trade remedies. There'll be no problems
because they are already.
Is this what you're saying?
Already agreed by the WTO?
No. Can we just get this on the record as Secretary of State for International Trade? You're saying if the UK adopt measures that are EU measures, there will be no problems from the WTO.
There will be no problem, but we will not apply some of them because they will not apply to the UK.
So there will be no problems from the WTO a second after midnight when this happens. This will be fine.
Not on trade remedies, no.
Okay. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to talk a bit about the rollover of the EU's trade and trade-related agreements. And first off, to congratulate the Department on the progress that's being made. You mentioned earlier that now 63% of the value of trade, if you exclude Japan and Turkey from the figure, has been achieved. I just wanted to understand, is it the same when you look at, for example, those are deals which have been done. So in a sense, that is not a no-deal situation. So I would congratulate you on that. I mean, how many of those countries with which you have done those deals has said or has agreed in writing that under a withdrawal agreement that they would be committed to allowing our trade to continue in the same way as it does now?
Well, all of the ones with whom we've agreements naturally would want that to continue. In an implementation period.
So they've agreed that, have they?
They have. Unsurprisingly, they want the continuity. We have at all points in this process, we've made it very clear that because of time constraints and legal constraints, that it's effectively a two-stage process. We have to have continuity, a safety net, if you like, and then we can have ambition later on. We've always said to countries, in this rollover of the EU agreement, we've seen this as a down payment to future liberalisation and a future improvement where we can get it. And that's been a very widely understood principle. Countries in general also understand that were we to deviate from the concept of replication by more than we have to make certain changes to create a UK agreement, not an EU one, then that would take us into territory legally that would inevitably involve delay. Sometimes that's been more difficult than others to get the understanding of the legal process and the differences that we may have, but it's generally well understood.
So when it comes to rules of origin, because at the moment with those countries, they are able to accumulate the content within a product that we export to South Korea, for example, at the moment. It doesn't matter to what extent that product originates from the EU or from us in the UK, ex-EU. So how's that going to work in the future? How many of those countries have agreed to that full effective accumulation of EU content in our products or UK content in EU products moving to them?
So if the committee will remember that one of the points that was raised about the Swiss agreement was that it did allow that accumulation. So for the 3-year period, it allowed EU content and UK goods going to Switzerland to be counted as UK content for the purpose of that. That's also the agreement we reached with South Korea, because these were the major economies where that was an issue. The advantage of that, which a lot of people said wasn't a possible agreement to get, we seem to be living in a perpetual environment, people say agreements are not possible. It was possible to reach that. And it does give us, of course, at the point of exit, whether that point of exit is at the end of whether it's a no deal or a deal, it enables us to have that period of stability to be able to negotiate a future agreement without disruption because of rules of origin complications.
Yeah.
Did you want to, John?
No, I mean, that's correct.
Yeah, so that is true. I can confirm for the South Korean agreement. I just want to say thank you on behalf of my constituents in Leonardo who are looking to export helicopters to South Korea, because that would help with that. What progress is being made with the Koreans in terms of investing in more Wildcat helicopters?
Niche question. I actually held discussions with my counterpart in Seoul 2 weeks ago on exactly that issue. And I'm expecting a reciprocal visit to the UK where we can actually carry on that particular discussion. We highlighted it, and what we were looking for was greater access to the procurement part of the South Korean Defence Department in the same way that other countries have been allowed access. I made a specific request to our ambassador and his team, and our trade team would be able to get access to that, because getting the same access as one of our major competitors had is a major determinant in whether Leonardo is able to get that contract. It is, you can inform your constituents, it's high on our agenda.
Well, it's good to hear of Leonardo benefiting from EU trade agreements and their continuation, much needed EU trade agreements. Julia Lopez.
Yeah, one of the key agreements that's been made in terms of rollover is the Switzerland trade agreement, which you signed in February, and we anticipate being in place by 31st of October. So if we were to leave the EU without a deal at that stage, this was potentially one of the agreements that we would seek rapidly to improve and deepen. As you know, the Swiss are currently embroiled in a big row with the EU over access to each other's stock markets after their equivalence regime lapsed. The financial editor of Die Welt says the EU Commission was the big loser in this. They made a miscalculation over the leverage they had over Switzerland. So to what extent do you think a deeper partnership between the UK and the Swiss could provide leverage to both parties in their negotiations with the EU, and what discussions have been had with the Swiss in this regard?
I think I was right in counting 7 questions.
No, just 2.
In that. Well, of course, this was an issue that the Swiss were discussing during our discussions, the potential of the European Commission to end equivalence of the Swiss stock market with the EU. I think it's very unfortunate that this has happened. I think that the net effect of this has been that additional cost will fall on investors unnecessarily. I think in terms of the EU, it looks like an overreaction. A number of commentators yesterday were using the word bullying for Switzerland, but of course the Swiss refused to be bullied. The Swiss said that if the EU ended its equivalence, the Swiss would bring in their own mitigation measures, which has happened. Of course, one of the places hit by that was London, because around 30 to 35% of Swiss stocks trading took place in London. That business is gone from London. And I think that the politicisation of this event, which of course was to force the Swiss to come to a quicker consolidation of previous treaties, I think is not a good sign when you're looking to show that the Commission will act in a fair, equitable and proportionate way. But I say that, Chairman, not having the policy responsibility on this, but I'm very aware of how much help the Swiss gave us. The Swiss went out of their way to help bring our agreement to fruition. They're still working very hard with us to deal with the parts of it that are not finalised. And I think it's a great pity that this situation has arisen. And I think it is not to either the advantage of the Commission or their reputation, or the Swiss, who I think have been put in an invidious position.
I mean, is it right to say that within the withdrawal agreement there's no guaranteed access for UK services providers to the EU market? And you know, as far as we go forward on this, and they are difficult on that regard, Switzerland is a big financial centre, as is London. So how do you think we could work together to make sure that the EU has constructive talks with us in terms of future financial services access?
In the longer term, the answer is in in a multilateral agreement on services, which we would like to see happening. In terms of London, the sheer scale of London, I think, affords a great deal of protection in terms of access to capital, access to insurance, and so on. I hope that the EU will look at this experience over Switzerland and say that this was perhaps an unwise thing to do, because all it has done is create friction where there was no friction before in an area where it didn't exist, and bad feeling which didn't need to happen.
Creating frictions where frictions don't exist.
Sorry?
Isn't that what Brexit's about? Creating frictions where frictions don't exist?
Switzerland is already outside the European Union. Yes. Switzerland had an agreement on equivalence in 2017, and this is not actually about a debate about the stock markets or equivalence. This has been that power being used as a lever against Switzerland to achieve an element in another part of policy. And I think this is a development in trade policy that we would not want to see accentuated. Trade policy should be about trade policy. Trade policy should not be used as a weapon in other areas. It will lead to further friction and discord inside the trading system.
Can I
yes, indeed.
Is any of this the EU sending a signal to the United Kingdom to say that in any future treatment with the UK that they would then start to try and get us to abide by things that we might not otherwise want to do, and if we don't do it, then we'll have repercussions too?
Might be described as leading the witness in a court. But I think that, the EU has a dispute with Switzerland. The loser in this largely is the trading in London. Yeah. There might be those that would want to read parallels. I couldn't comment.
Okay. Once we've left the European Union, the relationship between the London financial markets and Switzerland can be resurrected?
Oh, yes.
Will that happen straight away?
I imagine it would.
Thank you. Just what I'm hearing then, says the EU are holding the cards, sending minnows like Switzerland and the UK messages of some sort or other. So it's quite interesting.
I wouldn't regard the United Kingdom as a minnow. If the United Kingdom is a minnow, what are the comparative parts of it?
To the EU. To the EU. Well, we see the Republic of Ireland is, for the first time in 800 years, is punching above the UK because it's got 26, 27 allies. Secretary of State, I just want to confirm something. The EU content in UK goods to South Korea is covered in the agreement that you've done. What about UK content in South Korean exports to the European Union?
That we cover our bilateral trade. The arrangement does not cover what South Korea does with the European Union. That was not within our remit.
So we won't have as good a deal.
It is not within our responsibility what South Korea does with the European Union.
We know that revocation will give us the best deal with the European Union. Your deal's the second best and no deal's the worst. But in this situation, we've now gone from the best deal with South Korea, which was under the EU umbrella, to a deal that's not as good, yeah?
Our deal is with South Korea. We're not responsible for the triangular relationship that consequently the EU has with South Korea or vice versa. That's for them to decide, and they would take that into account in coming to a cumulation agreement with the United Kingdom.
At present, if you've got a deal that will allow UK contents and South Korean export to go to the European Union, and then doesn't allow that afterwards, which deal would you say is better? The deal that allows the UK content in South Korean products to go to the European Union, or the deal that doesn't allow UK content?
Position that allows the United Kingdom to, in time, have its full independent trading relationship with South Korea is what I think is the best, which is why I think it's best to leave the European Union.
But it's not as free, because now you're not free to put as much UK content in South Korean exports to the United Kingdom.
This is an agreement that lasts for 3 years. It gives us stability until we're able to negotiate our own independent trade policy.
The independence not to trade, it would seem, on that. Anyway, we'll get bogged down. Gareth Thomas.
Just the rollover Andean agreement was signed on 15th of May. There's been a considerable gap before it was got laid before Parliament. What's the reason for such a delay? Perhaps while you're on that, I wonder if you'd also reflect on the problems with the UK CARIFORUM economic partnership agreement, which had to be relayed So speed in Parliament being able to see the details and a quality assurance process to make sure that stuff doesn't have to be withdrawn.
Indeed. John?
Thank you. So on the Cariforum one that was relayed, I mean, that was a sort of formatting and publishing issue. There was no difference in the substance of the agreement, and obviously it was regrettable, but it was really a technical change that we had to make. On the Andean one, I'm sorry it took longer. I mean, we tried to do these very quickly, within about 10 days, I think. This one took a few weeks. The main reason for that was simply the intensive discussions that were happening in the run-up to the signature, which meant that we weren't as prepared subsequently. But we've looked at how we do these things, and we will try and avoid that in the future.
You will avoid it in the future, or you'll just keep trying?
Well, obviously we're committing to avoid it.
You will avoid it in the future.
Thank you. As with the rollover with Chile, the UK granted more generous tariff-rate quotas than is indicated by the data on the historic usage of the quotas granted with the EU. Can I ask, why did you do this? Is that not giving away part of your bargaining position for a future agreement?
John?
I mean, I don't have the detail of the Chile agreement in front of me, but as a general rule, what we have done with all the TRQs is look at a proportionate usage of our share of the UK, of the EU TRQ. And there are various ways of calculating that. There are some TRQs which have had very little usage, and therefore you can't go on historic data. You can look at a percentage of UK trade as a percentage of the EU. You can look at the particular product. So in different cases, we have tried to maintain the principle of our share of the EU quota, but you will find that there are slightly different percentages that have resulted from that in particular cases. I'm sorry, I can't comment in detail on the precise Chilean number.
The principle in which we operated was that we wanted to apportion TRQs in a way that fulfilled three criteria. One, that didn't disadvantage our trading partners. In other words, they wouldn't get less access to the UK market than they had already. Secondly, that it wouldn't cause market distortions in the UK in terms of prices to consumers. And thirdly, that it wouldn't cause unexpected competition with UK producers. These were, I think, appropriate ends in themselves, but they were also to ensure that we had compatibility with WTO law. We said, however, while we were looking at a 3-year basis for disaggregation of TRQs, we would be willing to look at any evidence that countries gave us. Some countries, a 3-year may not be for domestic or climate or other reasons, may not be a fair estimate of what the quota would have been. And we were willing to look at other data. So where that has happened, it has been a general rule that we do allow deviation from the exact number where the case can be made for that.
It's very noble of you not to want to disadvantage your trade partners, but isn't it more the case that you probably had to give this because you're under pressure to get agreements rolled over? This is not a rolled over agreement. This is an agreement that's more beneficial to Chile than they originally had. And would New Zealand and Australia not look at this new principle, maybe the Fox principle, of not wanting to disadvantage the trade partner by giving them a greater TRQ? And there's huge risks in what you've just done.
Well, we're looking, as I said, we've tried to be as fair as possible. We want to ensure that we get an agreement. We want to ensure that we are not putting ourselves in a position where we will infringe WTO rules.
Does it not risk creating a precedent? Of Britain being seen as a soft touch
no.
in the negotiation of these rollover agreements?
So in some areas, for example, we would look at a TRQ and say we would accept 95% of that EU TRQ if the UK was already absorbing that amount. But in other commodities, we may say the UK is only absorbing 0.5%, so that's all we're going to accept of that. And we have been doing it sector by sector because that's how we think we get a fair balance. And all through, we've said we wanted transparency in the process, and it is to provide continuity. That's the aim of the policy.
isn't the pressure here that you, having promised to have trade deals rolled over a minute after midnight, put yourself in an awkward position, and that countries such as Chile could exert a bit of pressure because you wanted to come back shutting trade deals in our time, and Chile played hardball with you and demanded a greater TRQ, and you now have to say that you want not to disadvantage trade with the partner. The partner got something out of this. You got nothing out of it because of the pressure you're under, and you're starting to give away advantages for no other reason other than your own rhetoric of a year or two ago.
No, we want to provide continuity. We operate within very clearly set out rules. We've made our position very clear at WTO. Countries understand our position. And of course, as I said, the continuity element is only part of our wider policy to have more ambitious trade agreements in the future.
I mean, I said earlier, the EU holds the cards. It seems here that Chile is now holding more cards than it did with the United Kingdom, thanks to the trade agreement you've rolled over and added on to Chile's advantage.
Well, as I said, in some places, the TRQ might be slightly larger or smaller if there are circumstances that warrant it, and that's the process that we set out. It's the process we followed. We've not deviated from that at all.
Sure, it wasn't just a mistake. They sort of got one over you. You weren't following the detail closely enough.
I think that's highly unlikely given the detailed natures of these.
So you'd be able to write to the committee to clarify exactly why.
If the committee wants me to write in detail about the Chilean agreement, I'm very happy to do so.
Thank you. Do you think the Canadians were perhaps with a greater eye on the detail and thought, well, Chile have played a good one here. Let's play our cards a bit closer to the chest and get some cards from the UK, just as Chile have done, and get greater advantage to Canada. I mean, it's the UK that's in the difficult position, not Canada. BrExit's put the UK in a difficult position, as Chile have understood.
No, it's not my interpretation at all.
Okay. Marcus Fish.
Question 9.
Yeah.
We recommended in our report on the US that an overarching trade strategy should be produced by the department. Where are we on that? And are we going to be able to have that examination of our offensive and defensive interests in trade strategy soon?
Well, we set out, for our wider consultations on future trade agreements, where we want to be on that and where we think there should be scrutiny by Parliament. Obviously, this committee will have its role to play on that. We've finished our consultation on public consultation. We'll shortly, before Parliament goes up for the summer, publish our response to the consultations on that, our summary of the consultations. We have our working groups with the United States, but we are all the time cognizant of the fact that we are under a legal obligation not to negotiate a new trade agreement with the United States while we're still members of the EU. Very grateful to the US for setting out, the USTR for setting out to Congress what their position would be. We will do the same in due course when we are in a position to be able to launch a negotiation, which, of course, we're not at the present time.
And you mentioned earlier some of the effects that were being seen on account of the no-deal tariff schedule having been published by the EU in terms of its effect on negotiating future trade agreements. I just wondered whether you were seeing any effect other than what you've described already in terms of your talks with other nations as to their willingness to engage with us in such a situation?
Well, of course, there's a wide understanding that what we were setting out was a no-deal position that would be a temporary position. Yeah. If I explain why, the whole approach was that if we liberalised from 80 to 87%, as it turns out, that would be to avoid an input shock. This is a country that has a very large volume of imports coming into it across a whole range of commodities. Also, in terms of our exports, about 23% of our exports contain an imported content. So our exports would be vulnerable to a price shock too. Because of those import costs, it could easily push up the price of our exports were we not to take any action on day one. And there are a number of scenarios. The committee will be whereas some of them about what estimates of potential devaluation of sterling would be in a no-deal scenario. Our aim was to provide a temporary cushion so that we did not get either an inflationary or an export cost push into the UK economy. No policy decision has been taken, and of course we will have a new Prime Minister and a new government that might take a different view on those tariffs. So that is why we have set it as a temporary tariff arrangement up to 12 months. It could be shorter, which is why we've been trying to impress on those countries whom we're in discussion for continuity, that they can't take any advantage they may get in the short term from temporary tariffs as a long-term advantage, and would be better to be in a proper continuity agreement with the UK.
Right. And has it made any difference in terms of your discussions with them on the concept of continuity within the framework of the withdrawal agreement, if one were signed, relative to what would happen if we went out without a deal?
Well, in terms of our current discussions, not the United States. Obviously, that doesn't apply.
That doesn't apply.
Only really applies at the moment with Canada, as has already been mentioned, because a lot of the perceived advantages Canada would have got from a continuity agreement with the UK in relation to a rollover of CETA, they see as also being available through the day one tariffs. Again, the point I reiterate is that these are temporary tariffs. They could change, and they could change. Would not be responsible for what a future government would say. If I were in the position of a partner, a trading partner, I would want to ensure that I had that continuity agreement, because I couldn't take for sure that the same advantages that would apply in terms of market access from the current short-term day one tariffs would apply for a longer period.
What about with Japan? Do they take the same sort of view? Or,
no, Japan is a different case. The Japanese government is very keen to negotiate a future FTA as soon as possible, and we've had discussions with them about what their legislative constraints would that be. Their parliamentary process is slightly different, from when an agreement could come in, so we have to take account of that. We've had regular discussions with them. I held discussions when I was at the G20 in Japan again 2 weeks ago. Their appetite is undiminished to get that agreement with the UK. They see it as being based on the EPA, but they want it with the EU, Japan EPA, but they want it to be far more bespoke.
Thank you. Well, just a final question on that. So are you getting feedback from them that they've seen what you've done with South Korea, which is going to be an advantage to Korean car companies, for example, being able to import cars into the UK tariff-free? Is that an incentive to the Japanese and even to the Americans to want to have an agreement with us as soon as possible?
Well, trade is entirely about comparative advantage, and it's a very, very dynamic picture. And of course, the more that we can bake liberal access into agreements, the better. And I think if I may say, it's a really important point that we want to make, that Britain's direction of travel is towards greater liberalisation. We don't want to see greater tariffs. Tariffs are taxes, and taxes have to be paid by someone. And we want to move to a lower tariff regime globally where we can. If we can use a multilateral route, we will do so. If we can use a plurilateral route, we will do so. If we have to use a multi-bilateral route, we will also do so. But the UK's aim is very clear. We need to move to a lower tariff and lower regulation trading environment, because it's consumers and taxpayers who are suffering as a consequence of not doing so.
Interesting, lower regulation indeed. Secretary of State, sometimes in the committee, just before I turn to Julia Lopez, sometimes in the committee, and a situation like this can be quite adversarial, but there has been some talk amongst committee members of a report into offensive and defensive interests that the United Kingdom might have. In countries that are more sophisticated and have greater track record of trade agreements, that work is as an historical continuity. Would it be useful to your department, do you think, if the committee were to probe around in that area in a constructive manner for you?
Oh, if the committee...
You're surprised by this, that it's not adversarial, I think.
No, and nor do I ever assume that the question is entirely what the intent might imply.
No. Please, don't be suspicious. You're with friends here.
I think in terms of moving forward, looking at the areas where the UK would gain advantage from a liberalising trade agreement, and looking at the areas where the UK would want to maintain protections, is a sensible thing to do. If the committee is offering to do some of that work, then we would be very, very happy for the committee to feed that in and to respond to it in due course.
That was the only question I had there. There was nothing extra to that question. Julia Lopez, it's good copy here.
Yeah, DIT's consultations on future agreements with Australia, New Zealand, the States, CPTPP, they closed almost 9 months ago, but we've not yet seen the responses to that published or any analysis of those responses. First of all, when do you intend to publish those responses? And secondly, I presume you've seen the responses yourself, and I wonder what it teaches you in terms of how you would wish to sequence the negotiations of agreements with those parties. And what capacity do you think your department has to be able to negotiate those agreements simultaneously?
The answer to the first question is before the rise for the summer recess. So that's later this month. Mm-hmm. In terms of the negotiations themselves, we are, when we leave the European Union, which is the key determinant, then we can begin. Our discussions with the United States and our trade working groups have been very useful, but ultimately the government will need to decide what the big asks and what the defences are that the UK will want to have. When we do so, we will, as we said, after the consultations, we'll publish our outline approaches, effectively like the USTR did to Congress. These are the big high-level outline approaches to what we want, plus initial economic assessments, which will be necessary for that. During the process, we will publish round reports after each round of negotiations and an annual trade report on all the negotiations as they progress. I've had discussions with the committee privately about how we move on scrutiny, and that's making progress. I don't know, Chairman, whether we want to discuss that, but I know we've got another meeting to come up. We're moving in the right direction on that, and of course at the end we'll lay the full treaty text before Parliament with an explanatory memorandum and a full impact assessment, and I've already given the commitment that we'll leave enough time for this committee to produce a report on that before we begin the ratification process. So that's the process part of that. We will be ready to deal with those because we have already designed the Department's manpower to be able to deal with United States, Australia, New Zealand. Potential access or accession to CPTPP would come later in that process because they're not ready to see any new members take part. There would be additional stresses on the Department were we to involve Japan as an early FTA, for example, and that would be a discussion we would have to have with the other parts of government about the resource necessary for us to do that. My general experience is that other parts of government are very keen for us to do more and more things, but they're not always very keen to ensure that the resources are available for that to happen. But it is a genuine debate we need to have if we want to have greater engagement internationally on trade, and we want to see a global Britain. We can't do it on a shoestring.
So you're confident then that you have the resources on the 31st of October, should we leave without a deal, to be able to start simultaneous negotiations with the US, New Zealand and Australia?
Yes.
And then as a secondary, potentially Japan?
If we have to go beyond, so we've set out our department is designed to deal at the moment in terms of manpower laydown and resources with Australia, New Zealand and the United States. If we go beyond that, then that's a decision, a wider decision for government about how we allocate our resources. And if I may, actually, it goes beyond that because the debate has all been really about free trade agreements, not really about the next level, which is market access. And so if I might just give an example of that, Chairman. So when we wanted our to do the agreement on market access in China for the dairy industry in Northern Ireland, we faced a single regulatory issue, that milk from the Irish Republic could be sold in China, milk from Northern Ireland could be sold in China, but milk could not be incorporated from Ireland into Northern Irish products that then could be sold to China. Now, that was a market access issue. It was worth about £250 million over 5 years to the Northern Ireland dairy industry. That took quite a lot of negotiation with China and therefore resource and manpower. And so at a sub-FTA level, there's a huge amount of work that can be done on market access. And we will have to, when the spending round comes, think about that and think about how we think departmental resources should be allocated, because I think that as a broad principle, we should be looking to see where we allocate resources that can generate income for the country and not just absorb it.
I've read that Jeremy Hunt, with you as his Trade Secretary, would look to roll DEXU into a DIT so that you would have one department negotiating the future EU-UK FTA and all the other FTAs we seek to strike. So in the event of a no deal, how rapidly do you think that could be done? And does your department and the resources of DEXU combined have the resource to be able to conduct all of those negotiations simultaneously?
Well, the addition there would be nothing that we've already identified. If there were to be a decision taken that the future economic partnership between the United Kingdom and Europe should be done by DIT, that clearly requires a fair amount of extra resource. We've not quantified that because we've not been asked by government to do so. And that's the only basis on which we would carry out as an official government department that particular function. I think there is huge merit in having a single architecture that carries out those negotiations. I think to begin a negotiation with the European Union that is separated by however many degrees from our negotiations with the United States runs the risk, however explicit our mandate to Parliament, of divergence in that process and creating conflicts further down the line. So I have long believed, and I've long argued, that a single architecture is required. I think the most logical single architecture is that the Department for International Trade has the lead on that because it already has the responsibility for the other FTAs. I'm sure there are other ways of government to do that, but I think that having, from a personal point of view, having overseen a huge machinery of government change in creating DIT and bringing UKEF, UKTI, trade policy, and a whole range of other parts together, it's very disruptive to do so. And I think it's wise to use the machinery of government. Consolidation, I think, is much easier than creation of whole new departments.
Do you think that's been one of the flaws in the process of leaving the EU so far, that DEXU has been making concessions that have a big impact on your own department's ability to conduct future trade negotiations in the way that you, as Secretary of State, might hope?
Well, of course, Cabinet is there to reconcile, and Cabinet committees are there to reconcile those differences inside the machinery of government. There would be an advantage of having it inside a single architecture where the negotiations on multiple fronts were controlled and any divergence was able to be nipped in the bud, as it were, rather than dealt with by a process of reconciliation further on.
So has that not been working?
Well, I mean, we haven't, of course, begun the discussion on the future economic partnership. This is one of the frustrations, is that we actually haven't been able to do that. And when we leave the EU, and we are having to have those negotiations with the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, we will have to ensure that they are not happening, which we have prepared for, in a way that is being derailed or undermined by the direction of travel of the negotiation with the European Union.
Quickly, I think in answer you mentioned there.
Sorry, but that, you know, Ms. Lopez always asks very complex questions.
Forensic
complex answers.
Forensic, Columbo-style questions. You mentioned in answer to one of the good questions there about the countries that are would be blocking or would not be allowing the UK to join CPTPP. Who are they again? Whose policies would be that they would have no more members, which would affect the UK if it wanted to join?
No, it's just that the accession process won't begin yet for CPTPP. Not all members have fully ratified the agreement, and until it's been fully ratified, they won't begin the process of accession of future members.
How long might that take?
that is way beyond what we are able to predict.
Thank you.
For example,
I just hear
well, there is one particular problem, which is whether Malaysia will in fact ratify CPTPP at all, and if Malaysia doesn't ratify, whether the others will begin an accession process beyond that. But that is way beyond the remit of the UK government.
Thank you, Faisal Rashid, and then Gareth Thomas after.
Thank you, Chair. During President Trump's recent visit, he said that the NHS would be on the table in a future US-UK trade agreement. Can you say with absolute certainty that a trade agreement with the US will not affect the NHS?
I think that we'll also find that the President said it wasn't on the table at the press conference the next day. And of course,
what's your view?
What say you?
Yeah.
I say that the NHS is not for sale. The NHS is not for sale to either domestic or foreign players. The NHS will remain free at the point of use to all those who require it in the UK. Okay. And the government will not enter into a trade agreement that gave away the rights for us to determine the running of our own public services.
Okay, so if the US wants to, obviously, during that negotiation, to have NHS on the table, so should we differentiate between potential impact to the supply of NHS services and provisions affecting the price and availability of pharmaceutical products?
Well, I think you have to make a differentiation between the NHS, the running of the NHS, and the access to UK citizens, and the access for the NHS to the healthcare sector. We've got a big healthcare sector in the UK where a lot of jobs are dependent on access to international trade. So clearly we have to take that into account in anything that we do. But we couldn't agree to any proposal, for example, on medicines pricing or access that would put NHS finances at risk. So there is an area of overlap there. And so anything that we did on the wider healthcare sector, which is reasonable, where we couldn't allow that to impact on the basic running of the NHS, where, for example, on pricing of medicines to impact on the NHS finances itself. So we would have to guarantee that didn't happen. And we couldn't agree to anything that in any way, shape or form ever allowed the regulation of the NHS or forced privatisation to be enforced upon the UK.
Okay, good to know that. But given the ongoing trade war between US and China, the US's approach to global trading norms more generally at the WTO, can we really be confident of securing a positive deal for the UK in any future agreement with the US?
Well, we would only sign an agreement if we thought it was in our interests and if we thought there were sufficient safeguards put in place. Otherwise, we wouldn't sign it. That's kind of self-evident.
Like giving Chile greater TRQ.
Yeah.
I don't regard allowing Chile to be able to give evidence to us on the basis of our agricultural access based on their own historical experience to be in any way, shape or form an equivalent argument to what would happen with the NHS. I have to say,
but
I don't often say this, but I mean, as somebody who trained in the NHS and worked in the NHS, I would not agree in any way, shape or form to diminishing the government's ability to regulate over the NHS itself. I can't really be much clearer.
And given you're an opponent of ever closer political union, you will realise, of course, there are 4 NHSs within the United Kingdom, that one of the governments of the United Kingdom wouldn't be stomping all over the area of another government of the United Kingdom's NHS.
Well, in terms of future trade agreements, that's one of the areas we're looking at the moment, is how we get a system in place that where different parts of the United Kingdom have responsibility for delivering on a trade agreement, that they have to have an input into that system. When I recently met with both the Welsh and Scottish governments, my view to them was fairly unequivocal. My view was that there should be a match between responsibility to deliver and influence in creating the agreement itself. I think that is first of all it's an inevitable consequence of our constitutional settlement on devolution, but B, I think it's a fair and equitable way of dealing with the other parts of the United Kingdom. Trade is a reserved policy, is a reserved issue, and ultimately trade agreements will be the responsibility for the UK government and the Parliament of the United Kingdom. But where other parts of the United Kingdom are responsible for delivering it, there is that consideration that I mentioned, the fair and equitable treatment of those parts of the United Kingdom. But secondly, there's a very pragmatic issue, that anyone that we negotiate with will want to know that we can deliver an agreement. And by having had a previous agreement on how that would operate within the United Kingdom, I think would be a prerequisite to anyone else wanting to sign it.
I'm sure you will appreciate why there is so much anxiety in the market, in the general public about this US-UK trade deal and NHS being on the table, because there is already creeping privatization is already happening. So there is so much anxiety. But I'll come on to. Any privatisation of the NHS that's decided by the British government falls within the British government's ability to regulate. The previous Labour government privatised more NHS services than any government in history, but that was the sovereign right of that British Labour government to do so. It wasn't because of pressure elsewhere, and so it's a question of maintaining the sovereign right of the government. Well, the governments can do what they want and will change between parliaments, but that was the right of the government to do so. Over the last 9 years, a lot more than ever before. But
actually, that's untrue.
Well, you can agree, disagree. We can.
I'd love to present the committee with some evidence.
This is another health for the health committee. Sorry.
Just coming back to in its potential trade deal with the UK, US does not want to have restrictions on cross-border data flows and call the EU General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR) an unnecessary barrier to trade. How is your department going to ensure protection of personal data and privacy in a potential trade agreement with such powerful trading partner?
Well, it's an issue. Data flows have to be tackled. It's a global issue. I think you've got two issues. One is the flow of data, and the other is the protection of data. I have to say, as a citizen, I'm very happy that my data is used for the greater good wherever that's possible, but also want it to be protected adequately. And there'll be questions of equivalence of GDPR and so on when we leave the EU, but there'll also be wider issues. And at Buenos Aires, at the WTO ministers' meeting, this was one of the top issues. Of course, in the Japan agreement with the UK, this is one of the areas of disagreement that Japan has. I think it's fair to say that their concepts of data flows don't sit easily with the EU's concept of data localization. So there are issues to be dealt with there, which are also opportunities for the UK.
Well, how would you deal with it, though? Because when the US is saying it's unnecessary barrier to trade, so it's a big statement to say, and we are very protectionist. We want to protect our, data and policy. So how your department will ensure that?
There are different issues here. Again, the flow of trade and the protection of data are not necessarily the same thing. So most countries in the world would accept that you can move data, particularly anonymised data, much more freely. But this is an area that we will have. This is not just in our negotiation with the United States. This will be in our negotiation with Japan, and it will be a wider WTO issue because at pretty much every WTO session, it also arose at the OECD session that we had. It was at the top of the agenda of many countries about, in a modern economy, is it conceivable that you can move goods and services but not data in an equal way? And if you can move data equally, how is the data protected as you do so? I think that is the key issue, and that's the issue to resolve.
I think this flagging up the winners. Time, as ever, is your great enemy. Julia Lopez, you want to come in with a brief question?
The conversation's moved on slightly, but I just want to return to the issue of the NHS and particularly pharmaceuticals, because it's my understanding that the US administration feels that the NHS is probably not paying enough for pharmaceuticals. Now, when Australia's had FTA negotiations with people like China and America, they've been able to carve out exemptions on pharmaceuticals, but it was very difficult for them to hold the line. Is the US administration, in your opinion, aware that we would seek to carve out similar exemptions on pharmaceuticals? And insofar as that limits the ability to deliver other benefits from an FTA, what do you think that those limits would be?
Well, as I said, I don't think we could agree to any proposals on medicines or access to medicines that would put the NHS finances at risk or that would provide an impediment to either patient or clinician choice. So that would be our aim.
And they see that as a red line. I mean, the discussions you've had in the working group, they understand that red line.
No red lines, because red lines only occur when we have negotiations, and we are not permitted by law to have negotiations. I make extremely clear.
But you have a working group, so do you think that there's an understanding in the working group that that would be an area of carve out?
I think there's a broad understanding in the US that the UK takes the protection of the NHS on a cross-party basis very seriously. And while we would want to see liberalisation in the broader healthcare sector, we couldn't allow that to impinge upon the running or the financing of the NHS. So there would be a line. Liberalisation in the healthcare sector, giving greater competition to the many goods and services the NHS wants to buy. If it can get the same quality at lower price, that's one of the benefits of competition. But, and there's a very big but, it cannot be a very small but. It cannot be about the access to the NHS free at the point of care, nor could it be impinging upon the government's right to regulate the NHS, nor could it affect the finances of the NHS as a consequence of other agreements.
Thank you. We're now going to move to Gareth Thomas and we'll run then back to Julia Lopez. So we've got areas that we've got reports underway that we use for evidence for reports as well. Gareth Thomas.
Just on services, if Brexit goes ahead, you'll obviously seek to use a variety of measures to achieve access to other countries' services markets. I wonder if you could just talk through your priorities for those particular routes. Would they be free trade agreements? Would it be initiatives at the WTO, market access work carried out by DIT? And then particularly the most controversial area of future services arrangements at this stage are probably going to be around Mode 4, around the movement of people. And I wonder if you talk us through what discussions you had with the Home Secretary and at an official level, your officials with the Home Office about red lines around Mode 4 negotiations.
That's about half an hour's worth, Chairman. Yes, services liberalisation is really important. So estimates are that the costs of trade and services, if we want to call that in its broader sense, is about the same now as the costs are about the same relatively as the cost of goods about 50 years ago, where goods liberalisation has gone way beyond the pace of services liberalisation. And therefore the costs, number one, but the regulatory barriers to services liberalisation are there. Now, I had discussions yesterday with a number of senior American politicians about the fact that in the service sector, access disputes are very often not at the federal level at all, and so the concept of dealing with it in an FTA is really beyond our ability because they are state-level restrictions. So access to practitioners in medicine and law, to take one example. So in service liberalisation, we have to take it, as you correctly say, at multiple levels. Where we can get multilateral agreements on services, that's great. And we would, when we leave the EU, want to give a major impetus back to the Trade and Services Agreement at Geneva. That Trade and Services Agreement, one of the many stalling points, is on the very point that was raised by Mr. Rashid, which is data flow, where the United States and the EU are at loggerheads about the concepts of data localization, holding up the Trade and Services Agreement. So resolution needs to occur in that. So TISA would be a major one. Where we couldn't get liberalisation at a multilateral level, we would have to look to plurilateral agreements, but open ones on the basis that they were a building block to a multilateral agreement in the future, and we would want to utilise all the alliances that we have on that, and we would want to perhaps start that on the current things on e-commerce, pushing some of those agreements forward. It's unavoidable that one of the asks of other countries in any agreement will be Mode 4. It's particularly acute, I think, in the UK because of the amount of foreign direct investment coming into the UK. As the committee knows from its previous session with Minister Stewart, and the UK is the third top destination in the world for foreign direct investment. even before we take anything else into account, intra-company transfer demands from inward investors are high. And I entirely understand that. If I were investing a lot of my money in another country, I would want to use my own people to do that. That has an impact on that.
You understand that, but talk us through whether the Home Office understands that.
Well, I think that this is where there needs to be a broader debate in this country about migration and how migration should work. And
rather than the debate about the country,
so
let's have your debate with the Home Office.
So it is a debate that happens inside and outside government. My view, my department's view is roughly this: that if you ask the British public what they think about migration, they'll give you a pretty clear steer.
Yeah, but just tell us.
And I will. I'm coming on to the specific. They will say that people who come to Britain, who have a job, who pay their wages and abide by the law, are welcome in our country. But people who come, this was the issue over free movement, people who come and who are able to access services without contributing, maybe less so.
So I know that those who come are contributing more than those who are here.
I think that there is already out there a reservoir of support for a concept that says whatever parameter we set numerically on migration into the UK, it should favour the movement of labour. And where we have an economic basis for that, that would be acceptable.
And the Home Office accept that?
Well, I think that there's I would put it, and I have put it in this way, that if you are a country...
it's a relatively simple question. Is it yes or no? Do the Home Office accept?
I don't think there is a Home Office view any more than there is a single government view on this.
So you've had a conversation with the Home Office?
Oh yes, we have had lots of conversations.
So where have you got to in those conversations?
Our conversation is to make the case that I make, that I think that we need to prioritise whatever migration we have in the UK on an economic basis.
That
it needs to be about the functioning of the economy.
It sounds like you're a long way off on getting any agreement as yet to an approach to move forward.
Well, that will be where we are. This will fall within the remit of the next Prime Minister and the next government. My view is that we need to take an economically orientated view of it.
I know from personal experience, fishing boats in Northern Ireland and the west of Scotland are tied up because of the Home Office. Anyway, moving on, Julia Lopez.
Yeah, just a quick one. Why has the government not published an overarching investment strategy, and when does it intend to do so?
In line with our export strategy, but we haven't have an overarching one in that we've set out our strategy in a number of different places. We have a clear strategy for outward direct investment. We've got a clear strategy for inward direct investment. How we do that and the aims and the targets we have for that are set out in our departmental accounts, which are now Catherine's going to tell us when they're due to be published.
Within this month.
But on the issue of investor-state dispute settlement in future investment agreements, in particular, does the department have a view?
Well, we're looking at the moment in how we deal with that. I think in general terms, what we'll say is that we have to have a balance between the protections of UK investors abroad, which are considerable. We have a great deal of UK funds invested overseas. We want to make sure they're properly protected because they will carry pension liabilities and benefits in the future. But we also want to make sure that we're giving the appropriate legal balances. I think in general, what I would say is this, and we will be coming back to this issue, and it's something we are considering at the moment. My view is that as the 8th biggest investor overseas in the world, the UK, our investors expect in agreements reached by their own government to give those investments proper protection, given that they are very often necessary for the well-being, including in pensions, for people in this country. But there are different ways of doing so. So where we can guarantee those through the effective operations of a court system, where we have clear equivalence, we may rely on that. We may want to have different mechanisms in different places. I think we'll look at our own experience on bilateral investment treaties, of which there are 90, and we've never had a successful case brought against the United Kingdom. I think that's a very proud basis on which to take that forward, but the balance has to be there, and it has to ensure that those in Britain who invest abroad, their government protects those investments.
Faisal Rashid.
Thank you very much. You've visited China on many occasions since you become Secretary of State, and you've been very clear that China is an important partner to UK. At the same time, UK is also attempting to forge closer trading and political ties with the United States. How can UK manage the tensions of seeking deeper relationships with both parties, given the ongoing trade war between China and US?
By encouraging both parties to accept that a rules-based international system based on the WTO in Geneva is the best way forward, because the alternative to a rules-based system is a deals-based system, which would leave a great number of countries, I think, dispossessed in the system, and that ultimately trade liberalisation and the dismantling of barriers and the dismantling of tariffs is a way to improve the prosperity of our people. As I said, and I repeat, a tariff is a tax, and a tax has to be paid by someone.
So are they listening to you then?
I hope so.
In particular US?
Well, we make the arguments at every level. I meet with the American chambers, I meet with American politicians, I go on American media and I make these arguments, and I make exactly the same arguments in China. Of course, not having the same access in China to the political representatives or the political classes is something of an impediment, which is, I think it's worth us remembering that the United States is a liberal democratic society, whereas China is not.
Okay, so time is very short. So just very quickly, our committee heard evidence on Belt and Road Initiative recently, and it brings significant commercial opportunities to UK and UK businesses. What's your thoughts on Belt and Road Initiative and how you are promoting within the business community in the UK and how they can actually get involved?
Well, of course it does bring significant opportunities. But those opportunities have to be operated in a way that's consistent with the ethics and values of the United Kingdom. We have very clear sets of rules within which our business operates. And as you probably remember, when the Prime Minister was in China at the end of last year, she refused to sign the MOU on Belt and Road on the basis that we could not guarantee that the involvement of British businesses within that would be within the level of values and ethics that we would expect our businesses to operate under, and their partner businesses to do so. It's very important. It's very important if we are having global liberalisation, and Belt and Road in terms of the projects it could bring in development could be important, but it has to be operated on a rules-based system, and those rules have to themselves operate to values that we find acceptable.
Well, this is exactly what the China is saying, that it is rule-based, and it has actually evolved over the years, and since the Prime Minister has been into China. So what is the current
Then the government will keep that under review, and if we believe that what we're being asked to sign up to fits with our ethical and business values, then we would be able to do so. If it didn't, we wouldn't.
Thank you. And brief question, Nigel Evans.
Yeah, can I just ask you, Secretary of State, because Gareth intimated this could be your last appearance, and I hope it's not before this committee. Whoever wins the leadership of the Conservative Party, are you happy to serve under them?
My view has been very clear that we have a democratic process. It's our duty. It is our duty to follow the results of that democratic process, and as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, to work together to prevent the terrible calamity of an anti-left, anti-American, anti-trade Labour government.
Yes, under either candidate. Final question. Current position of the UK schedules in Geneva. Much fanfare was done when the schedules were placed. What's the situation of the UK schedules at the WTO?
One objection on GATS, which is Russia, not unexpected, but it won't stop us being able to operate those schedules on day one of a no deal if required.
Thank you very much. I've heard a lot this morning about getting rid of tariffs and making trade happen more easily, which is what the European Union has done quite successfully across the European continent. I have to put that at the end. Secretary of State, can I thank you for coming with your officials this morning? Much appreciated. We've covered a lot of ground. We've, as ever, I should say, not had enough time, but thank you and have a nice
Mr.
summer.
Chairman, and I promised Catherine that this time we would talk about the departmental budget.
Well, sorry, Catherine. Order.